Okay, I need to tell you something before we get started. The most famous fact about Florida, the one they taught you in school, the one plastered on tourist signs across the state, is almost certainly completely made up. Juan Ponce de León looking for the Fountain of Youth? Yeah, that story was almost definitely invented by one of his enemies after he was already dead. It was basically 16th century fake news designed to make him look like a fool. And here's the part that's even wilder. The guy who named Florida, who explored its coastline, who claimed it for Spain, he came back 8 years later to actually settle the place and got shot by an arrow. Evacuated to Cuba, died from his wound. So the man who gave Florida its name was killed by Florida. And that is not even close to the strangest part of this story. We are going 14,000 years back today. Ancient warriors, empire-level power struggles, a discovery that changed global trade routes forever, an unauthorized military invasion by a future U.S. president, and a group of people who technically never surrendered. Stay with me. This is the real origin of Florida. Alright, first things first. Let's get one thing very clear. Florida was not discovered in 1513. It was inhabited for thousands of years before any European ever laid eyes on it. And I mean thousands. Like 14,000 years of human history before a Spanish ship showed up. Here's what Florida looks like during the last ice age, roughly 14,000 years ago. Sea levels worldwide are significantly lower than today. Florida is actually twice as wide as it currently is, an enormous landmass extending far out into what we now call the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. And there are people there. Paleo-Indians, early hunter-gatherers, have migrated into the Florida peninsula from the north. These are not primitive cave people. They are sophisticated hunters, tracking megafauna across a landscape that looks absolutely nothing like the Florida of today. We're talking about mastodons, giant ground sloths, ancient horses, and saber-toothed cats. Florida was essentially a prehistoric safari park. And then the climate shifts, the ice melts, sea levels rise. Florida shrinks to roughly the shape we recognize today. The megafauna disappears, but the people, they adapt. They evolve their cultures, they build villages, develop farming, establish trade networks. By around 500 BCE, some groups have started farming growing corn, beans, and squash. A genuinely complex civilization is growing here. When Europeans finally arrive in the 1500s, Florida is home to several 100,000 native people in distinct tribal nations. In northern Florida, the Timucua, a large confederation of villages stretching from what's now Tallahassee all the way up into modern Georgia. Farmers, complex social structures, formidable warriors. In the northwest panhandle, the Apalachee, organized, militarily capable, serious farmers with elaborate ceremonial traditions. Down in the south, the Tequesta, the Tocobaga in Tampa Bay, and then the group I most want to talk about, the Calusa. And I need you to pay attention. The word Calusa literally means fierce people. These are not farmers, they don't need to be. They live on a subtropical coastline teeming with fish, shellfish, manatees, sea turtles, and birds. They build massive shell mounds. They run a tribute empire collecting taxes from dozens of other tribes across a huge area. When European ships begin appearing on the horizon in the early 1500s, the Calusa reaction is not exactly welcoming. Every Spanish expedition that ventures near Calusa territory gets driven away. These are not people who will wave hello and hand over their land. This is the world that exists thriving, organized, ancient, and completely self-sufficient when a Spanish explorer rounds the corner of the Bahamas in the spring of 1513. A world that has been here for thousands of years. Not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. Hey, quick pause before we get into the Spanish arrival. Which of these tribes do you think was the most formidable? Drop a comment below. Calusa, Timucua, Apalachee? My vote's the Calusa, but I want to hear from you. All right, back to it. So this is the world that exists for thousands of years. complex, ancient, deeply inhabited, not an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. And yet in 1513 along comes a Spanish dude in a boat who essentially goes, "I shall call this La Florida." It is April of 1513. Juan Ponce de León, Spanish conquistador, former governor of Puerto Rico, is sailing through the Bahamas. His mission: find an island called Bimini, which is rumored to be extraordinarily wealthy. He's got royal backing, a proper fleet, and a pretty solid track record. Ponce de León wasn't some hopeful amateur on a desperate long shot. He had helped colonize Hispaniola. He'd found gold in Puerto Rico. The Spanish crown had given him the title of governor. This was an experienced professional looking to expand an already impressive portfolio. On April 2nd, 1513, he spots a long, green, flowering coastline. Lush, blooming, beautiful. He notes the vegetation and the fact that it is Easter season in Spanish. The Easter celebration is called Pascua Florida, which roughly translates as the season of flowers. He looks at this blooming, beautiful coastline and he names it La Florida. Just like that, a name is born that will stick for the next 500 plus years. He comes ashore, plants a Spanish flag, claims the land for the crown, and then sails south along the east coast. And this is where he meets the Calusa. The Calusa, as we discussed, fierce people, not impressed, not interested. There's a confrontation near the southwest coast. Ponce de León backs off and returns to Puerto Rico. But here's the genuinely important discovery from this voyage that almost nobody talks about. His pilot, Anton de Alaminos, identifies a powerful ocean current running along Florida's east coast, the Gulf Stream. This turns out to be one of the most important maritime discoveries of the age of exploration. Every single shipload of gold and silver from the New World, every Spanish galleon carrying the wealth of an empire back to Seville, rides the Gulf Stream past Florida's coast for the next 2.5 centuries. Florida's geography makes Spain rich. The place they can't tame funds their empire. Ponce de León returns to Spain, gets his title as governor of Bimini and Florida. Yes, they're counting Florida as an island. At this point, gets permission to colonize and comes back in 1521 with 200 people, horses, livestock, and the intention of settling. He lands on the southwest coast, and the Calusa are waiting for him. The attack is devastating. The colonists are driven off. Ponce de León himself is struck by an arrow well-placed, possibly poisoned, and is seriously wounded. The survivors evacuate to Cuba. Juan Ponce de León dies from his wound in Cuba in 1521. The man who named Florida, killed by Florida. Now about that fountain of youth thing, I promised we'd come back to this. Here's the truth. There is zero evidence, that Ponce de León was ever searching for a fountain of youth. No ship logs, no royal documents, nothing. The story appears in writing for the first time in the 1530s, more than a decade after Ponce de León's death, written by a Spanish historian named Oviedo, who was connected to Ponce de León's political rivals. Florida's origin story was built on fake news before fake news was even a concept. After Ponce de León, Spain sends more expeditions. In 1528, Pánfilo de Narváez leads a large force into the Florida Panhandle. Things go catastrophically wrong almost immediately. The supply ships lose contact, the army gets lost. They build improvised rafts to try to sail to Mexico. Most of them drown. Then, in 1539, Hernando de Soto leads an even more ambitious expedition. 600 soldiers, horses, full equipment through the Florida Panhandle and across the entire American Southeast, all the way to the Mississippi River. De Soto dies before he can return. A fever takes him near the Mississippi in 1542. His men, desperately trying to maintain the psychological dominance that the Spanish had cultivated over indigenous peoples, secretly sink his body in the Mississippi River so local tribes won't realize their supposedly godlike leader is mortal. De Soto gets a river burial at midnight. Spain is spending enormous lives on Florida and getting basically nothing back. Spain is spending an enormous amount of money and human life on Florida and getting very little in return. But then, France gets involved, and suddenly Spain is very, very motivated. In 1564, A group of French Huguenots, French Protestants, facing brutal religious persecution at home, establish a colony called Fort Caroline near present-day Jacksonville. Spain sends Pedro Menéndez de Avilés with a fleet and an army. He lands on the Florida coast in September 1565, establishes a fortified base, and names it San Agustin, St. Augustine, which as of today is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in what is now the United States. Older than Jamestown by 42 years. Menéndez doesn't stop there. He marches overland to Fort Caroline in a surprise attack during a hurricane, of all things, and destroys the French settlement. The French colony is finished. Spain has its first real, lasting foothold in Florida, and it starts building the most remarkable fort in the New World. For roughly the next 2 centuries, Spain controls Florida it's never a wealthy colony. But Spain builds a massive mission network across northern Florida, dozens of missions, drawing the Timucua and Apalachee into the Spanish religious and economic system. Sometimes willingly, sometimes not. But in 1702, British forces from the Carolina colony march south and raid St. Augustine. They can't take the fort. The coquina absorbs cannon fire rather than shattering, but they systematically destroy the missions across northern Florida. By 1704, most of them are burned. It's one of the most catastrophic cultural destructions in North American history, and almost nobody talks about it. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, the global peace settlement requires Spain to hand Florida over to Britain. Just like that, the Spanish residents mostly pack up and leave. Britain divides the territory into East Florida and West Florida and actually starts building proper infrastructure roads, organized towns, expanding plantation agriculture. Then the American Revolution happens. Spain sides with the Americans. Britain loses. And the 1783 Treaty of Paris hands Florida back to Spain. Here's the situation in Florida at the start of the 1800s. The original indigenous nations, the Timucua, the Calusa, the Apalachee, are effectively gone. Wars, disease, enslavement, civilizations that existed for thousands of years destroyed within 2 centuries of sustained European contact. It deserves to be named as the tragedy it is. Into the depopulated north of Florida, a new group has moved, the Seminole. They're primarily Creek people from Georgia and Alabama who migrated south in the 1700s. And here's the part most people don't know: escaped enslaved people from American plantations. Also find refuge in Spanish Florida, sometimes granted freedom in exchange for military service. By the early 1800s, the Seminole are a significant and formidable presence across northern and central Florida. And the young United States, expanding rapidly southward, is not happy about any of this. From the American perspective, Florida under weak Spanish control is a problem on their southern flank. Enter Andrew Jackson. In 1817, General Andrew Jackson, war hero, future president, a man historically famous for doing things his own way, leads U.S. military forces across the border into Spanish Florida without explicit congressional authorization. This is the First Seminole War. Jackson destroys Seminole villages, captures Spanish forts, briefly occupies Pensacola. Spain is furious. Spain complains loudly. Spain doesn't do much else because Spain is dealing with revolutionary uprisings across its entire American empire and simply doesn't have the military capacity to push back. Negotiations begin. On February 22, 1819, Spain signs the Adams-Onís Treaty, officially ceding all of Florida to the United States. In exchange, the U.S. gives up its claims to Texas, which we would very much come to regret, and forgives $5 million in Spanish debt to American citizens. Florida purchased, basically. Andrew Jackson is appointed as the first American territorial governor of Florida. He lasts approximately 11 weeks in the position before resigning and going home to Tennessee. The paperwork, apparently, was not his thing. But the Seminole are still here, and they are not going anywhere. In 1830, President Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act, calling for the relocation of all southeastern native peoples to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Some Seminole leaders agree, many do not. Under the legendary leader Osceola, Seminole warriors wage a brilliant guerrilla campaign across the swamps, forests, and hammocks of Florida. The Second Seminole War begins in 1835. The Second Seminole War lasts until 1842. It cost the U.S. government between $40 and $60 million, an astronomical sum. As many as 2,000 American soldiers are killed. Osceola is captured in 1837, not in battle, but under a white flag of truce during peace negotiations. He dies in captivity in 1838. Even many white Americans at the time were appalled. After the Second Seminole War ends in 1842, a small group of Seminole, perhaps a few hundred people, remains deep in the Everglades. Unconquered. They never sign a peace treaty. They never agree to removal. Their descendants are the Seminole tribe of Florida today. They call themselves, with completely justified pride, the Unconquered People. With the Seminole Wars winding down and American settlers flooding in, Florida's push toward statehood begins. After years of congressional debate, one state or two, slave state or free, on March 3, 1845, Florida is admitted to the Union as the 27th state. The first governor is William D. Moseley. Florida is officially American. Florida in 1845 is a slave state. Just 16 years after statehood, Florida secedes from the Union and joins the Confederacy in 1861. After the Civil War, Reconstruction follows. And then the Florida that most people recognize begins to take shape. Railroads, land booms, citrus empires, and eventually space programs, theme parks, and some truly spectacular news headlines. So here's where we've landed. Florida was not discovered in 1513. It was inhabited for over 14,000 years. The Fountain of Youth? Political propaganda from a rival who wanted to make Ponce de León look stupid. The man who named Florida was killed by the people who lived there. The territory was fought over by Spain, France, and Britain for 2 centuries before the U.S. walked in and took it. It took until 1845, more than 330 years after Ponce de León's first landing for Florida, to officially become an American state. And a small group of its original inhabitants never surrendered, never signed a treaty, and are still there today. Florida isn't just a state. It's a centuries-long collision of cultures, empires, and extraordinary human survival. Florida has been complicated, chaotic, and wildly unpredictable since the very beginning. Honestly, some things never change. If this video gave you a new perspective on the Sunshine State, share it. Your friends who think Florida is just beaches and Mickey Mouse deserve to know this too. And if you want to go even deeper, the full story of the Seminole Wars is one of the most intense, underrated, and genuinely surprising military sagas in all of American history. We've got that one coming up next. I will see you there.